Do you believe that America should be a colorblind society? For instance, should people be treated differently based on their race? It's just a yes or no question.
It's not a yes or no question.
It's a yes or no question.
It is as I said in the beginning of my testimony, America
yes or
has
no
not done right by indigenous peoples, by black people, by Asian American and Pacific Islander people.
Should people be treated differently based on their race? Yes or no?
People should receive the services and the support and the remedies that are
your answer
owed to
is
them.
that they should be treated differently based on their race.
They should receive the remedies that are owed to them because of the systemic racism and injustice.
Do you believe that race should be considered in employer hiring practices?
I do not believe that white people are the only qualified people for jobs.
I didn't say that. Nobody said that. I asked you if race should be considered in employer hiring practices. And you're not going to intimidate me by slandering me as a racist.
You're also, I did not call you a racist.
No,
you're not going to intimidate me by insisting that I called you a racist.
And there it is. That is the whole game in one clip. A direct question gets asked, the question gets dodged, then the conversation instantly gets dragged into the usual moral smokescreen. That's why this moment hits so hard. Brandon Gill wasn't playing the word game. He wasn't accepting the academic fog. He kept bringing it back to the one thing DEI advocates never want to say out loud in plain English. Should race matter when decisions are being made? Yes or no? This hearing exposed something bigger than one awkward exchange. It exposed how a lot of modern DEI rhetoric survives by staying deliberately vague. The language always sounds polished. It sounds compassionate. It sounds enlightened. But the second somebody asks for a clean answer, the whole thing starts wobbling. Because once you strip away the buzzwords, the argument usually comes down to this. Yes, race should matter, but we don't want to defend that too clearly because regular people can hear how unfair it sounds. And that's why this exchange matters. It cut right through the theater and forced the issue into the open. So if you're tired of watching people use jargon to dodge basic questions, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below because this one deserves a real conversation. Now before we get into the rest of the back and forth, let's set the stage. Brandon Gill came into this hearing with one simple strategy. Stop letting these conversations drift into academic mush. Keep it concrete. Keep it understandable. Keep it where normal people live, not in the faculty lounge, not in a diversity seminar, in the real world. And once he did that, the cracks started showing immediately.
Do you believe that race should be considered in employer hiring practices?
I do not believe that white people are the only qualified people for jobs.
I didn't say that. Nobody said that.
That right there is not a misunderstanding. That's a maneuver. Notice what happened. Gill asked a narrow question about whether race should be considered in hiring. Instead of answering that question, the response jumped straight to a moral accusation that wasn't even made. That is the trick. Reframe the question so the person asking it sounds suspect, then act like you've won the exchange. But regular viewers can spot that instantly. Asking whether hiring should be race-based is not the same thing as saying only white people are qualified. Those are two completely different statements, and collapsing them together is exactly how bad arguments hide. And this is what frustrates so many people about this whole debate. The public is constantly told that DEI is just about fairness, opportunity, inclusion, empathy. Fine, great, sounds wonderful. But when someone asks the obvious follow-up, does that mean race gets weighed in decisions that are supposed to be based on merit? The answer suddenly turns into a cloud of accusation and abstraction. That's not clarity, that's evasion. Gill didn't let it slide, and that's when the witness started getting boxed in even harder.
You just told me that you believe that the racial demographic makeup should be taken into account in hiring practices. Who gets to determine which races are preferred?
Exactly. That's the trap the ideology creates for itself, because once you say race should be considered, you've opened a door you can't easily close. Considered how? For what purpose? In whose favor? Based on what formula? If a company is supposed to look more like some target demographic, then someone somewhere has to decide which groups are underrepresented, which groups are overrepresented, and who gets nudged forward or held back. That is not inclusion in the abstract anymore. That is sorting human beings by race and pretending saying it's enlightened because the paperwork uses nicer language. And this is the part DEI defenders always want to skip. They love the slogan. They hate the mechanism because the mechanism is where things get ugly. Once race becomes a factor, you don't get to act shocked when people ask which race benefits. That's the entire point of the policy. You can't build a system around racial outcomes and then clutch your pearls when someone asks how the racial outcomes are supposed to be produced.
It's a yes or no question. Should race be considered in employer hiring practices? Yes or no?
I believe that diversity ought to be considered as companies and other organizations attempt to reflect their customers, our country.
I'll take that as a yes. Which race do you think should be preferred?
I do not think that a single race should be preferred.
You just said that you believe that race should be considered in employer hiring practices.
I don't know. There's going to be a transcript of this hearing. I didn't say that in that way.
Okay, why don't you explain what you believe?
What I said and what I believe is that the demographic composition of workplaces, which our nation's military, and so on, our Congress, ought to reflect the diversity of the United States of America.
Demographic composition. Racial demographic. Is that what you're saying?
Racial, gender.
Okay, so race should be a factor in employer hiring practices. Yeah, that's what you're saying, is it not?
Organizations ought to attempt to match the diversity of their...
hopping around the question.
This is where the mask really slips, because we just want workplaces to reflect the country sounds harmless until you think about what it actually requires. Workplaces are not mirrors. They are not census replicas. They are not demographic art projects. They are institutions trying to function, compete, produce, serve customers, and hire the best people they can find. The second you say the workforce should match society, you are no longer talking about equal opportunity. You are talking about engineered outcomes. And let's be honest about what that means in practice. It means managers are being nudged to look at categories before competence. It means people start wondering whether they were hired because they were the best candidate or because they improved a spreadsheet. It means resentment grows, trust drops, and everyone is told not to notice the obvious because noticing it would be politically inconvenient. That's the genius of the branding, by the way. Diversity sounds warm. Representation sounds noble. Belonging sounds humane. But once those words become hiring doctrine, they stop being vibes and start becoming filters. Somebody has to decide who counts toward the goal. Somebody has to decide which imbalance matters. Somebody has to decide when enough is enough. And somehow we're all supposed to pretend that's not racial preference because the people doing it refuse to say the blunt part out loud. Then Gill takes the same logic and moves it over to college admissions, where the contradictions get even harder to hide.
Who gets to determine which races are preferred?
I already told you I don't have a single racial group.
You just told me that you believe that the racial demographic makeup should be taken into account in hiring practices.
And it should be reflected in all levels of companies and other organizations.
Okay, let's talk about college admissions. If two different children are applying for college, let's say one is white and one is black, and there's one slot available, should they be evaluated based on the same objective criteria? Test scores, for instance.
Are you familiar with holistic admissions?
Should they be held to the same standards regarding test scores?
I am a proponent of holistic admissions.
It's just a yes or no question.
Yeah, no, I can't answer that question for you as a proponent of holistic admissions.
Got it. I'll take that as a no.
And there's the pivot, holistic admissions. Another phrase that sounds sophisticated until you realize how often it functions as a permission slip for unequal standards. Now, to be fair, nobody thinks a human being is reducible to one test score. That's not the issue. The issue is whether objective benchmarks stay objective when race enters the frame. Because once you start applying standards differently in the name of history, equity, or social repair, you are no longer judging applicants by the same rules. You are distributing opportunity based partly on identity. And that's exactly why this conversation became such a national flashpoint. Parents know what it means. Students know what it means. Everyone knows what it means. One kid studies, performs, hits the mark, and still has to wonder whether the rules are actually the rules. Another kid gets told the process is holistic, which might sound generous in theory, but often feels arbitrary in practice. That kind of system doesn't build confidence. It destroys it. The deeper problem is moral, not just procedural. A society cannot keep preaching equal treatment treatment while carving out elegant exceptions for treating people unequally. At some point, the language collapses under the contradiction, and that's what Gill was exposing. Not with some grand speech, not with a 10-minute lecture, just by refusing to let the witness hide inside a vocabulary wall. Now, the broader media and academic world usually treats this framework like settled wisdom, like only a bad person would even question it. But that's precisely why voices like Coleman Hughes have become so important. He doesn't buy the premise that the cure for past racism is a new system obsessed with race in the present.
Fighting racism and the politics of racism.
Right, so racism as defined by Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, judging people on the basis of their race rather than their character and so forth, that's not what my book is against fighting. Obviously, we should all fight that, no matter who it's directed at. What my book is fighting is this ideology that really was born with critical race theory, the adult version of critical race theory in the 70s and 80s, and became more popular over the past 10 years, that equates whiteness with evil, equates blackness with a kind of moral superiority, stereotypes whole groups of people, says that your race is an essential part of who you are, and feels even that children need to be taught this from as young an age as possible, because they're born with the wrong attitude about race, and it needs to be sort of hammered out of them by separating white kids from black kids, from Hispanic kids, putting them in different corners of the room, as was done in my Columbia University orientation some 9 years ago.
That is the cleanest distinction in this entire conversation. Fighting racism is not the same thing as building an ideology around race. Those are not the same project. One tries to reduce racial thinking. The other multiplies it, institutionalizes it, and then calls itself justice. Hughes is saying something a lot of Americans still instinctively believe, even if they're tired of getting yelled at for saying it. The answer to racial prejudice is not more racial obsession, it's less. And that's why people like him make the activist class so uncomfortable, because he strips away the emotional blackmail. He refuses to accept that every disagreement with DEI orthodoxy is proof of bigotry. He challenges the idea that fairness requires permanent group sorting, and once that challenge lands, the entire moral intimidation strategy starts to weaken. That's also why you see so much energy spent discrediting the messenger instead of engaging the point. If someone says, judge people by standards that apply equally, that should not be a scandalous statement. 10 years ago, that would have sounded normal. Now it gets treated like a provocation because too many institutions have invested too heavily in the opposite idea, that justice means managing society through identity categories forever. But here's the real problem. Once you teach people to view everything through race, they do not become less tribal. They become more tribal. They become more suspicious, more cynical, more self-conscious, and more divided. Every achievement gets second-guessed. Every selection gets politicized. Every institution starts looking less legitimate, not more. That is not social progress. That is social corrosion with a friendly HR tone. So the big takeaway from this hearing is simple. Brandon Gill forced a conversation that DEI advocates usually control with language, and the minute he forced plain English, the argument started falling apart. If race should matter in hiring and admissions, say it clearly and defend it honestly. But if you can't bring yourself to say it clearly, maybe that tells us everything we need to know about the weakness of the position. Because most Americans, left, right, or somewhere in the middle, understand a basic truth. Equal treatment should actually mean equal treatment, not equal treatment with footnotes. Not equal treatment unless a consultant says otherwise. Not equal treatment once the demographics are adjusted. Actual equal treatment. That's why this exchange landed. It wasn't just a gotcha moment. It was a rare moment of clarity in a debate that is usually buried under slogans. And that clarity matters. Let me know what you think in the comments. Was Brandon Gill right to pin this down to a yes or no question? And do you think DEI as it's practiced now is about fairness or about ideology? Hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.